Hello everybody and welcome to this very special video. Today we're joined by the poet Beatrice Garland and we're going to talk about Kamikaze. Thank you for having us.
Pleasure.
Well, an amazing poem, and I would love to start off by asking what inspired you to write a poem about a kamikaze pilot?
Yes, I know that you thought maybe I had some particular connection with Japan. In fact, only very tangentially. I'll explain why in a minute. What really set me off with this poem was the destruction of the Twin Towers. If you remember that.
Yeah.
Yes, 7/11, wasn't it? 9/11.
9/11, yeah.
Which, of course, most of the people reading this poem these days won't have been born then. But for me and my generation, that was the most shattering event. And one of the things I found most extraordinary about it was that there were young men in the prime of their lives who were willing to destroy themselves, and thousands of other people, of course, in the service of a cause that they believed passionately in. Now, of course, I don't believe in that cause, and most of us don't. But the fact is, they were willing to sacrifice their lives in order to do it. And partly because I've worked in the National Health Service for most of my working life, and the subject I've been most engaged with is that of trauma. I went on thinking about it, and I wanted to know, what is it that will make somebody willing to blow themselves up in the service of a cause? And is it just nowadays? So I started to research it, and of course I found it's gone on all through history. And one of the examples, one of the most notorious and famous examples, are the Kamikaze Pilots. Yeah. You probably know that these were young men. Once Japan had entered the side against England and America, and France, of course, during World War II, they entered on the side of the Germans. They wanted their young men to get into aeroplanes, one-way aeroplanes, which would fly out to the Pacific and dive into the Pacific, the American ships in the Pacific, and blow everything up in exactly the way that these modern young men flew into the Twin Towers and blew them up. And again, it's this same thing. What is it that makes them willing to give their lives for it? Now, I found a very interesting difference, which is that all the young men in Japan who were sent out as kamikaze pilots were, of course, ordered to do so by the Emperor of Japan. Yeah. And it is a very shameful thing. It's just not done to defy the Emperor. And that, I think, is very different from today's young terrorists who do it because they believe it. Yeah. Now, when I read the English newspapers of the time reporting back on what happened, it made it quite clear that a lot of these young men just didn't want to go. The editor of one newspaper said they were like a herd of sheep going to the slaughterhouse. They had to be loaded into the planes. And when they if they turned back and came back, one young man came back 9 times, and he was executed then. Now, with the young man in the poem, don't forget, this is a work of imagination. I don't know that poet. I don't know that pilot. I don't know what his family life was like. It's all imagined. It's invented. So what I did was to think of, first of all, the story of the pilot who decides that dying is not worth it. Life is too precious. Life is absolutely beautiful. And you see that from the descriptions of what he sees as he looks down at the sea beneath him and at the little ships strung out like bunting. He values it too much to throw it away and to kill hundreds of other young men in the process. So he makes a decision, which is a decision on the side of life. Now, it's sort of paradoxical because he saves his physical life and he saves the physical life of all these young men on the boat, young Americans on the boat, but he loses his emotional life. That is the life he has with his family and with his children. And it's one of his children who is telling the story. And I imagined her, a young woman, talking to her children about her father, and imagining what her father remembered of his father, who of course is her grandfather. There's one slightly confusing moment in the poem when I put in italics to show that it's the young woman who's speaking. She says, yes, grandfather's boat. Actually, it's the children's great-grandfather. There are 4 generations in the poem. Yeah. But I couldn't have put great-grandfather because it would have been clumsy from the point of view of meter and rhythm. And also, she's very caught up in the story she's telling. She says, yes, grandfather's boat.
Yes, I think that is one of the most interesting parts of the poem is the choice to tell it from the daughter's perspective. Because obviously you started with the idea of the Kamikaze Pilots. So why did you decide to write it from the perspective of the daughter?
Well, it comes more naturally to me to think of how a woman would talk about it than a man. And I've got children. So how do you explain to your children what your father did or didn't do, particularly when, as in the case of this young woman, I think she feels bad about the way she treated her father. Because at the end of the poem, if you remember, she too and her brothers and sisters fall silent. They don't talk to the pilot anymore because he is regarded as a shamed individual, that what he did was shameful rather than heroic, which is my view of it. Just incidentally, about the Kamikaze Pilots, I read this poem once at a reading, and there was a Japanese poet in the audience, and he told me that some of the Japanese pilots ditched their planes in the sea close to the American ships rather than crash into them. And of course, they were picked up by the Americans and made prisoners of war and spent the rest of the war in captivity. But at least they were alive.
Yes. Amazing. So, as you know, this poem in the exam comes into the cluster of power and conflict.
Yeah.
And I'd love you to explain how you think it fits into that. There's obviously this conflict in the poem. The pilot feels this conflict, but there's so much conflict and so much power. So if you were to be asked, well, why does this poem fit well into a cluster of power and conflict? What would you say about that?
Well, it's set in wartime, and war is conflict, and human beings are, I'm afraid, very given to fight each other for power, for territory, for money, for prestige, whatever it is. Man is a very warlike species. And so that's the bigger context, war. There's also the more private conflict, which is, do I do this or don't I? This is the pilot thinking. Do I go and kill all these young men or don't I? Do I stay alive or not? And that is a conflict. And that's the sort of conflict that every single human being faces, I would say, every day. Do I do this or don't I do it? And is this a good thing or a bad thing? And this is what being a human being is. We have the opportunity to consider these decisions before we carry them out, make them. We don't, of course we act impulsively sometimes, but if you're flying over the Pacific Ocean on your way to your own death and the death of hundreds of other young men, you've got plenty of time to think about this conflict, examine it, and think, well, which side am I going to come out on?
Yeah, and I think certainly from the way I read the poem, reflecting on what's going on beneath him, the beautiful nature, he seems to have an impact on his decision. He's sort of torn, isn't he? The conflict, that inner conflict of do I do what I've been ordered to do? And I think I never really thought about that it was an order, not
yes,
a
it was.
choice. Or do I do what I want, really feel is the right thing to do?
Yes, that's important, you see. It's not only what I don't want to kill myself, and actually, I don't think it's right to do what I'm going to do. Now, I don't know what this man thought because I've made him up, but it seems to me reasonable that some of these young men will have thought, actually, what are we doing this for? We're going to kill everybody. The two countries can just kill each other in the end.
Yeah. Yeah, amazing. And then, of course, when he returns, there's more conflict with everybody at home, his wife, his children, and neighbours, and
that's true. But that's a very subtle and I think poisonous kind of conflict because they just do not engage with him. Yeah. They blank him, and anybody who's in school knows perfectly well how awful it is when your friends blank you and cut you off, won't look at you, won't talk to you, won't share anything with you. It's a nightmare situation.
Yeah. So that's the conflict, that sort of the national versus the personal conflict.
Yes.
What about the power? Where do you think the power is in the poem? Obviously, there's the power of the emperor to say you should go and do this, but the power of the whatever it is that causes the pilot to think, no, I'm not going to do it, seems to win out, to be stronger.
Look, individual power, the decision to do something you think is right or not to do something you think is wrong, is immensely powerful. You may lose your life in doing it, emotional life or actual life, but that is your personal power. You can say no.
And do you think, this is a sort of hypothetical, I guess, but do you think, given everything that was to then happen, the pilot would have regretted his decision?
Look, we're talking as though he's a real man. Of course, my pilot, my invention, I think he'd have felt very sad. Very sad. Worse than sad, he'd have felt very depressed and even despairing at times because he's cut off from everything that gives life meaning, which are the relationships you're surrounded by. He's cut off from all that. He's got to live on his own from then on. He's got to live on his own internal resources, and that's terribly difficult. It's why solitary confinement is used as a punishment. You've got to live on your own internal resources. Yeah. Do I think he regretted it? No.
It was the right thing.
It was the right thing to do, yes.
I know that you told me via email that you worked on this poem for some years, and I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the process then, the writing process, and why it took so long to get to the final edit.
Well, as I said, the beginning, the impulse was to understand what it is that makes young men willing to kill themselves in the service of a cause. And I think that this poem is a story, and I think once I had the story in my head, because that's where it starts, in your head, and I want to say something more about that later, but when it starts in your head, you carry it around for a while, and there comes a moment when you can put it on paper. And I do mean on paper, not on a word processor. I always carry a notebook and a pen or pencil, no pen these days, and I write it down. And I write down words and phrases that sort of hang together for me, that make sense. For instance, her father embarked at sunrise. It's got a very distinct rhythm, da 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 da, actually. And the point about sunrise is that it is the sun on the Japanese flag that is being invoked at that moment. Now, once I'd got the story, I wrote the whole thing in a way, and I knew how it would end. Now, I knew how it would end because I knew from a Japanese colleague that the pilots who turned back were shunned by their society. But I then put it away in a drawer, which is what you must always do when you've written something. Put it away, don't think about it. When you come back to it, you see things that you hadn't seen before. You see things that don't feel right, don't sound right, are superfluous, because always when writing, what you're doing is paring down, and paring down, because a poem is a highly condensed piece of exposition of something or other, a thought or a description or an idea. And so it got further and further pared down until I felt I'd got all the essential elements there. The area where I allowed myself more freedom to say more was in the description of the sea, because it's that hooks into the mind of the young pilot flying over the sea and makes him think, actually, life is better than death. When I look back at the poem, actually, I see I should have edited it a bit more. For instance, one of the stanzas begins, and remembered how he and. Now, it's not good to finish a line on and. I should have done, and remembered how he, and then you want to go on to the next line, and the next line can begin with and his brothers waiting on the shore. So there is always something more you can do if you're careful. And I just let that go. I mean, I didn't see it before I sent it out for publication. And I didn't send it out until 2005, 2006, something like that.
Yeah, amazing. And you were saying you wanted to come back to this idea of what's in your head.
Yes, I did, because you asked me about the process of writing. And what is absolutely essential for the process of writing is that you allow yourself time and space in which to use your imagination. Now, imagination is something that everybody has got or got the potential for, but an awful lot of imagination is sopped up these days, soaked up and dispersed into social media. And so I would say for any young person who actually was thinking about writing something serious, do yourself a favour, put away the iPhone for 24 hours and just see what there is in your head. Notice what you're looking at, notice what you're hearing, what you're thinking, and allow it to cook inside your head. And then you'll start to have things that you want to put on paper. But if you're constantly checking what your friends are doing, or where the next party is, or where the next wonderful bit of clothing you're going to buy is coming from, you'll never do it.
Little aside then, have you always written poetry?
No.
Have you always been creative?
Well, it depends how you count creativity. I've always liked making things. Actually, there's a line by a poet called Ruth Pardell, which has always stuck with me, and it's called "Making Things is Our Defense Against the Dark." Wow. Now, it's a powerful line, and it's true. Now, I cook, I sew, I knit, I write poems, but my job also involves writing. I've got several technical books out, that sort of thing. So I've always made things, and I like it.
Yeah.
It's my defense against the dark.
So you touched on this earlier. A lot of the poems in the same cluster as yours explore the power of nature. And it seems that upon reflecting on nature, that's what really makes the pilot think this isn't worth it. And those amazing lines, I really love the line, "A tuner, the dark prince muscular," because it seems to me in a poem about war and all of this kind of chaos, the most powerful figure seems to be this tuner. I wonder, was that deliberate, the idea that it is the power of nature that really influences him, or was that just more that triggered the memories of his own father and coming back in the fishing boat?
Well, don't forget, for a fisherman, to catch a tuna is big. You've probably got enough to feed you and your family and all the neighbours, and some to go to the market to sell. So a tuna is a big catch, a big fish. But also the Dark Prince, for me, that's something like a figure of death in the background. And he's had all these good memories of his father, sitting on the beach, chucking pebbles at little cairns of stones, seeing which are going to last against the tide longest, all that kind of thing. There's just a sort of hint of death in that moment, the Dark Prince.
Well, that leads nicely on to the next question. I know you said that you spend a lot of time paring down the poem to the absolute essentials, and that is fascinating. I think that really will help us to understand how important every word, every line is.
Every word.
Yes.
Every word's got to earn its keep, even and.
Yes, absolutely. And I just wonder if you could talk about the structure of the poem. You've got this tight control of every stanza being 6 lines, but then it's in free verse, there's enjambment, there's a full stop here. What as a poet, when you're writing, what influences those decisions? Because this is the bit, I've got to be honest, this is the bit where students will say, Beatrice Garland didn't think about putting that full stop there. She wasn't even thinking about, and I would love you to be able to talk about that.
Well, I think it partly comes from what I was saying about let things evolve in your head. And what you will find is strings of words evolving in your head, and you put them down. Now, they're quite right. I didn't think twice about putting that full stop there, but it's important that there is a full stop there, because there's a change from what he's thinking about and what he's imagining his father saw, or he saw, and his life with his brothers on the shore. But then it ends, and the woman starts to speak again, and it moves into direct speech at that point. She's actually talking, and in camera terms, it's like a change from a wide angle to a close-up. Yeah. Suddenly you're close up on the woman, and she's saying, and though he came back, he never spoke again. We never spoke again. So what I would say is, you can't write a poem until you've found, however loosely, until you've found the form for it. You can't just write blah on and on like that. You've got to have in your mind a structure. And of course there are hundreds, thousands of poetic structures, and you can chop and change. You can move this way and that way. You can do it in 2 lines or 3-line stanzas or 5 or 6. All I can say at the end is that it felt right to do it like that. So each stanza is like a little fish. You can capture the stanza, you can land it like a fish in your boat, and then go on to the next one. But you start with the overall structure, and in this case, and in many cases in poems, it's a story. A poem often tells a story. Even if it's a story of what am I thinking at this minute, or what am I feeling at this minute.
So you think it happens sort of organically? For example, each stanza being 6 lines, there wasn't a sort of a conscious, more of that felt right?
Well, I could have done 3-line stanzas, but actually I think that breaks up the story a little bit. All I can say is it felt right.
Yeah.
And you've got to go with, in the end, with what you like, what feels right.
Absolutely. Well, I wonder if you would read the poem for us. That would be amazing if you would give us a reading.
Yes, Kamikaze. Her father embarked at sunrise with a flask of water, a samurai sword in the cockpit, a shaven head full of powerful incantations, and enough fuel for a one-way journey into history. But halfway there, she thought, recounting it later to her children, he must have looked far down at the little fishing boats strung out like bunting on a green-blue translucent sea, and beneath them, arcing in swathes like a huge flag, waved first one way then the other in a figure of 8, the dark shoals of fishes flashing silver as their bellies swivelled towards the sun, and remembered how he and his brothers, waiting on the shore, built cairns of pearl grey pebbles to see whose withstood longest the turbulent inrush of breakers, bringing their father's boat safe, yes, grandfather's boat, safe to the shore, salt-sodden, awash with cloud-marked mackerel, black crabs, feathery prawns, the loose silver of whitebait, and once a tuna, the dark prince, muscular, dangerous. And though he came back, my mother never spoke again in his presence, nor did she meet his eyes. And the neighbours too, they treated him as though he no longer existed. Only we children still chattered and laughed, till gradually we too learned to be silent, to live as though he had never returned, that this was no longer the father we loved. And sometimes, she said, he must have wondered which had been the better way to die.
Fantastic.
It gives me a lump in my throat as I come to the last 2 lines.
Yes, it's a
there's something I want to add, which you've not...
Please do.
Which is... there are watery sounds in the poem, the turbulent inrush of breakers bringing their father's boat safe, lots of S's.
Yes.
And salt-sodden, awash.
Yeah.
Cloud mark, now loose silver of whitebait. So although I didn't do that deliberately and consciously, I clearly didn't edit it out because it felt right. And I realise now, with hindsight, it felt right because all those S's and SH's sound like water.
Yes, absolutely. And I notice as well that it starts in the third person, her father.
That's right.
Embarked, and it moves to the first.
That's right. Now, when I'm saying her father embarked at sunrise, that's the poet speaking. The poet telling the story.
Okay.
So there is a narrator, and then there are the 4 generations of the family that the narrator is talking about.
Such a brilliant poem. Thank you so much for talking to us about it, and I'm sure the students around the country will find this really, really helpful.
Well, I hope so.
Brilliant. Thank you, Beatrice.